United States. And before joining this Sasakawa Foundation, Bob worked on the Senate Finance and House Foreign Affairs Committee. He was an International Affairs Fellow in Japan with the Council on Foreign Relations. And when he was working in Congress, I was also working in our embassy in Washington, D.C. long time ago, already around 20 years ago. We worked together at the time. He helped Korean embassy and myself a lot, and I really appreciate that. And also he worked as a CEO of a Washington and Seoul-based firm, providing advisory service on energy and educational projects, and as a senior advisor to the director of the agency overseeing the multi-trillion-dollar U.S. secondary mortgage market, and senior advisor at the international law firm. And in 2008, Bob worked as an advisor on Asian affairs for the Obama campaign and member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Bob has also served as visiting scholar at the Gay University and as a research advisor for the Pudong Academy of Development in China. And he holds a bachelor's degree from Yale, a master's degree from Harvard. You can imagine what he will do. And was a Fulbright scholar in Fiji. And as we all remember, we had Korea-Japan bilateral summit since, for the first time since President Park Geun-hye assumed office. So as a kind of follow-up measure, we'll hear from Dan Bob under the theme of the U.S. and Japan-South Korea competition in Washington Insider's View. And after we hear from Dan Bob, we'll have question and answer session. So, Bob.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Really appreciate it. I have to apologize. I'm a little bit under the weather. I've just come from Japan and Tokyo and then Okinawa, where we were at a conference with people from 34 countries, and someone infected about 15% of us before we left. So bear with me. Anyway, I started working in Washington in 1991 for a senator, a guy named Bill Roth, who was ultimately became the chairman of what's called the Finance Committee, one of the most powerful committees in Congress. He was actually someone who had a really personal, profound interest in Asia, not for political benefit, but just for personal reasons. He'd actually served under MacArthur during the Second World War in General Headquarters, and then was one of the very first Americans into Japan during the occupation. And he actually ran as a junior officer. He ran NHK for a few months before a more senior officer came in. He also happened to be have been born in Montana, and growing up he knew Mike Mansfield, who was of course became one of the great champions of Japan. But he also had a very close relationship with Korea. His son married a Korean woman here in Seoul in a traditional Korean ceremony. The whole family wore traditional garb. Before his election, he had a pink, I forget what they're called, but didn't make for a good election photo. But anyway, he had that personal interest in Japan, and his first two grandkids were both half Korean. Anyway, so I worked on Asian affairs generally for the senator, and in '91, when I first started with him, Japan was by far the most important country that was sort of in the headlines in the U.S. and the country that the U.S. was paying attention to. But that was all in a very negative sense. Japan was the country that we had extensive trade frictions with. It was the country that people were expecting to overtake the U.S. as the world's #1 economy. And so you had books written about the coming war with Japan. The Japanese in American popular movies were always the bad guys. You had books like, there was one about Agents of Influence, it was called, about how the Japanese were supposedly taking over Washington by spending lots of money. They were spending lots of money, but very badly for lobbyists who were very willing to take their money and didn't do much for them. They were also investing in the U.S. In grossly overpriced real estate. But they did try and spend their money to make friends in Washington. Now Congress, which is really very much a reactive body. It's not exactly a body that looks too far in the future, was preoccupied with those trade disputes, and that's really what I focused on the bulk of my time at that point, because the Finance Committee, where my boss was the second-ranking member and then ultimately the chairman, is, among many other things, responsible for international trade. And because we took a relatively benign view of Japan, we were also on the circuit for what seemed like every Japanese visitor coming through Washington, especially during something called Golden Week. There would be an endless train of, this is a holiday season in Japan for about a week, and every politician in Japan comes to Washington. We'd have dozens and dozens of visitors. Anyway, we also visited Japan frequently. We did things like create something called the Congressional Study Group on Japan that was intended to give members of Congress a chance to meet some of their counterparts from Japan and occasionally discuss key issues in U.S.-Japan relations. At the time, my work in Korea was pretty minor. I did travel here. I spent some time in North Korea, but Korea was not exactly a headline issue. It was nothing that Congress was reacting to until the 1994 crisis, the nuclear crisis that took place when the U.S. Came fairly close to a war that could have had devastating consequences. And then up until relatively recently, it was the North Korean provocations that were really what brought Korea to the fore in Washington. It was only with the Chorus FTA, more recently, the rift in Korea-Japan relations that Korea has had a more prominent role. Anyway, at the time of the '94 crisis and beyond that, there was really no discernible competition between Japan and Korea in Washington. And then over the course of the 90s, as Japan's economy slowed, interest in Washington began to wane. But one very specific result of the '94 crisis with Korea was a realization in Washington that Japan's very tortured interpretation of its constitution, where they were allowed the right of collective self-defense but not allowed to exercise it, became something of an issue. And Senator Roth and I tried to push the Japanese on this issue, where it was still taboo to talk about collective self-defense. We actually passed a non-binding resolution at the time that intended to generate discussions in Japan, and it was focused on Japan wanting to become, as it still does, wanting to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And so it was sort of indirect, but basically we passed a resolution which said, yes, Japan should be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, but only if and when it was able to exercise all of the obligations of any other of the current UN permanent security members. And so that was essentially code word for Japan needing to engage in at least discussions on collective self-defense. I remember well when we went to Tokyo shortly after passing this and having discussions privately with the media and the basically the response from top media people in Japan is, well, we can't talk about it, it's taboo. So things have changed, obviously, over the past 20 years. Now, and as a result, in 1997, there were some modest adjustments in Japan's ability to provide rear area support, again, in the aftermath of '94, and that's when we passed, agreed to some new U.S.-Japan guidelines, but it was quite modest in what it allowed Japan to do, and it didn't get to the heart of the problem, which was collective self-defense. So as the 90s wore on, Japan entered into a period of economic stagnation. It was no longer seen as going to overtake the U.S. economically. U.S. entered a period of economic growth, and then China, a series of events took place that really brought China to the fore. The first was the Taiwan Straits crisis, 95-96. Then came the reversion of Hong Kong in 97, which many of us were involved in. And then toward the end of the 90s, it was China's entry into the World Trade Organization, which became actually the last major accomplishment of the Clinton administration. And that was followed by the Hainan incident in 2001. So China became the country that Washington was most interested in Asia. I should say that Washington, it's hard for Washington to focus on more than one Asian country at a time. Generally, we're Capitol Hill and the administration tend to be rather simplistic in these things. Anyway, my personal time on Capitol Hill working on Japan diminished greatly while I was pretty fully occupied with all the events that were happening in China, as well as the 97 economic crisis in Asia. But particularly China's entry into the WTO, because we had to pass legislation providing China something called permanent normal trade relations, and that went through our committee, and we were at sort of on the lead on that. We supported it, that was unless and until that was passed, China essentially could not join the WTO. And it galvanized this legislation galvanized the business community and beyond. It was something we in the Finance Committee called the No Lobbyist Left Behind Act, because so much money was spent by so many on K Street to get this thing through, much of it unnecessary. But it was also around this time that President Clinton took a trip to China, where he did not stop in Japan, and that of course the Japanese did not fail to notice that, and so the Japanese had a phrase that U.S. views of Japan went from Japan bashing in the early 80s to Japan in the 80s, 90s to Japan passing in the late 90s, and then ultimately Japan nothing, because no one cared. Now, one result of that neglect, which was really quite real, was the creation of the first Armitage Group, and that's something that I was involved in with Rich Armitage and a number of us, about 10 or so of us. And the idea, this was 1999, the idea was to create basically a bipartisan strategy toward Japan that could be adopted by anyone, whoever ended up as president. And it was a really interesting set of discussions. We met pretty much every Friday morning over breakfast and had some wide open discussions. There were, well, we're on the record here, right? So anyway, there were some, I think there would be some surprises if we were off the record, I could tell you about on how the views of Japan were not always so completely positive. Anyway, the report received a tremendous amount of publicity in Japan, but like a lot of these reports, it probably would have been tossed aside and ignored shortly thereafter, except that Bush was elected president. Rich Armitage, after an internal struggle where he was supposed to become the Secretary of Defense, lost out to Rumsfeld and instead became the Deputy Secretary of State under his best friend, Colin Powell. And he and Powell essentially were given the Japan portfolio to run. And then in the aftermath of 9/11, Rich just, instead of doing a whole review of U.S.-Japan relations, Rich just took the Armitage report at one of the principals meetings and at the NSC and say, here, we don't have, this is our strategy, and that's what it became, and that's why it became really such a seminal, important work in the development of the U.S. policy toward Japan after 9/11. Now, Bush also developed some pretty close personal ties with Koizumi at the time, and then over the early 2000s, some of the arguments that were made, some were a little overblown, but we made the arguments that China should be in the WTO because it would help in the spur the development of middle class, which ultimately would make demands for greater changes and reforms and so on. That not only, of course, did that not occur, but the business community was not terribly happy with the openness that the Chinese provided as a result of the WTO, its entry into the WTO. At the same time, Bush and Kim Dae-jung were not exactly on the best of terms, certainly compared to Bush and Koizumi. And then with the arrival of Roh Moo-hyun, U.S.-Korea relations entered a particularly chilly phase. But after the departure of Koizumi, we then had these series of Japanese prime ministers lasting basically 12 months or less. And it was very difficult for the U.S. to either want to or actually to engage too closely with the Japanese, because by the time you'd sort of gotten to the point of coming to agreement on things, you'd have to start all over again. I remember well, I was talking to a friend in the White House at the time about, I can't remember which prime minister was visiting, and there had been some discussion of making this into a state visit, and basically the view of the White House was, we're not going to waste our time because this guy's going to be out of power in another few months anyway. Koizumi, of course, was the one who revisited Yasukuni for the first time after Nakasone did his one visit, and that did raise some eyebrows in Washington. But it wasn't really until Abe became prime minister for the first time that rivalry competition between Japan and Korea and Washington came out into the open. And that really began with the comfort women issue, when the House held some hearings on the issue, passed a resolution in 2007 calling for Japan to to really finally come to full terms with this. And this whole process was led by a Japanese-American congressman, Mike Honda, who was a Democrat, but he worked quite closely with the Republican, he's on the House side, he worked quite closely with the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Henry Hyde. Hyde happened to have a staffer, a friend of mine, who felt very deeply about this subject, and Honda had a friend who also felt very deeply, and though they came from opposite sides of the political spectrum, they really worked together on this, and that was reinforced by the Korean American community, which got very involved with this. Japan, up until then, and up until this year actually, had never had a prime minister give a speech before a joint session of Congress, which the only major country which was where that had been the case. I, over the years, and the senator I worked for, tried to convince the Japanese that this was an obvious thing to do, but the foreign ministry was always terrified that either something bad would happen or there'd be nothing substantive to say, which it was pretty strange. But it would have been easy, particularly because when Tom Foley was speaker, because he was very deeply interested in Japan. And one of the secrets about these joint session speeches, which wasn't known until recently, is it's really essentially just the speaker has to make the decision. That now has become clear with when Bibi Netanyahu gave his speech before the joint session of Congress without the blessing of the Obama administration. In any case, Abe made the attempt to give that speech, but Denny Hastert, who has since had a sex scandal and disappeared from Washington, but he was Speaker of the House. He also had an interest in Japan, having worked there when he was younger, and he was all in favor of it. But Henry Hyde intervened and basically convinced him that because of the comfort women issue, Abe should not be able to speak, and the idea was dropped. As I say, that issue also brought Korean Americans into politics sort of as a group, as a cohesive group, really for the first time. And even though there are only 2 million Korean Americans, they are concentrated in a certain number of areas, and they are not afraid of making themselves heard. And that contrasts, by the way, with Japanese Americans, who are not at all a cohesive political force. Most are third, fourth generation. They've just never been an ethnic voting group, despite attempts by some to make them into that. Most recently, there was the creation of something called the U.S.-Japan Council, created by the wife of the late Senator Danny Inouye, but that has turned into just a social gathering, really. The other thing is, Japanese Americans are not exactly greeted warmly when they return to Japan. They're not Japanese. Meanwhile, with the completion of the Chorus Free Trade Agreement, that really also began to bring Korea more into a prominent position in Washington. It was a difficult fight to get that through. It took an extra couple of years, mainly because of Ford Motor and one of my former colleagues on the Senate, a guy named Steve Biegun, who is very good at doing these things. But in any case, Korea, the embassy and its allies did a really excellent job, I think, of working on Congress to make sure this got through, not only directly with members and staff, but also making what's called a grassroots effort all around the country among the population. So things were looking pretty good when it came to U.S.-Korea relations. 2009, DPJ won its first victory, and the new Prime Minister Hatayama tried to move Japan toward a more balanced relationship between U.S. and China, which was not welcomed. He made his famous, said his famous quote to Obama to trust me when it came to Futenma, which didn't work out. And then one of his successors made a really terrible decision to purchase the Senkakus from private owners, something that the U.S. tried very hard to convince them not to do. I was sort of in background in this. It's a long story, but it was really poorly handled and should not have been done. But that led to some of the immediate problems with China. With Obama not exactly in having close ties with any of the revolving group of prime ministers under the DPJ, he actually established a very, very close relationship with President Lee Myung-bak. And in fact, that's really the one foreign leader in his entire time as president where he seemed to have warmed to another foreign leader. They just really seemed to hit it off. Then, of course, we had Prime Minister Noda, who made failed attempt to deal with the comfort women issue, followed by the election of Abe and Pak, and the real chill in Japan-Korea relations. China increasingly had its aggressive behavior in the East and South China Seas, and the administration had made a real attempt the Obama administration in its first year had made a real attempt for closer ties with China, but really were rebuffed by the Chinese. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the Chinese sort of took on a new attitude that they were they were had things right, the U.S. had things wrong. And when Abe came to power, there really was a palpable view in Washington that his revisionist historical views that and his plans, he said, to review, which he actually did, and possibly revise the Kono Statement, there was concern that it would inflame tensions with South Korea in ways that would benefit no one but China. And I think while Japan takes a very their view of China is that it's a real problem, even more so than the U.S. China's actions have clearly become an increasing concern for Americans really across the political spectrum. And that said, I think though there is some recognition in Washington that Korea's links to China are a little more complicated because of China's influence over North Korea, your important economic ties, and also I think underlying that is a sense that if and when the next provocation comes from North Korea, no one in Washington expects China really to be seen in South Korea as acting in South Korea's best interest. In any case, Abe proved to be far more of a practical politician when it came to history. And more important than that, he took some very, by Japanese standards and from an American perspective, some very daring steps economically with the institution of Abenomics. He joined TPP, which the U.S. wanted, and he was very helpful from an American perspective on security. Plus, it was clear that this was someone who would remain in office for more than 12 months. The notion, I think, that tends to be widespread here, that Japan is in fact on the cusp of remilitarization, renewed aggression in Asia under Abe, really is no longer a concern in the United States. In fact, it's when that issue was raised by our Korean friends, it really sounds a little bit, to be frank, a little crazy to most Americans who follow this, because first of all, they don't have the money to do it. There is, as we've seen with the legislation that they took up on security, this is not really popular stuff. Extended deterrence by the U.S. means that Japan doesn't have to do this. So it is something that comes up frequently with our Korean interlocutors, and it doesn't actually go over too well, I must say. So with all the things that Abe has done, Japan has begun to take a higher profile in Washington once again. It's also taken a higher profile in think tanks around town. In addition to the creation of this U.S.-Japan Council I mentioned, and the Tomodachi Initiative, which they run as an outgrowth of 311. Brookings has added a Japan chair. Carnegie has added a Japan chair. A group of the 8 or 10 most prominent Japanese universities have formed an organization in D.C. to bring Japanese scholars to the U.S. And frankly, Sasakawa USA has taken a much more prominent position. And I should emphasize, we're an American 501c3. We're independent from Sasakawa Japan. We do get funding from them, but we have never had any interference from them. And we now have our chairman, Dennis Blair, the former director of national intelligence and former commander of Pacific Command. So we've launched a whole bunch of efforts, from refunding this congressional study group on Japan, and a whole ambitious set of programs on things such as Myanmar, U.S.-Japan cooperation, science and technology, cybersecurity, democracy building, a whole host of things. Abe also, earlier this year, was finally able to realize this ambition of giving a speech before a joint session of Congress, which went over quite successfully. His statement on August 15th was generally well reviewed reviewed in the United States, but there were some who looked at it and were not quite as happy, especially when it came to some of the inferences that came out of it when it came to Korea. But the U.S. and Japan are now operationalizing our new defense guidelines with the passage of Japan's security legislation. And under Abe, Japan has committed a significant amount of funds for public diplomacy, including endowing a chair on Japan in Georgetown, making contributions to Columbia and MIT for enhancing Japan studies. Now, with China as a major security in Washington, D.C., Japan's time in the sun, I think, will remain. That said, if Abenomics proves to be ineffective and Japan's economy returns to lackluster performance, interest in Japan may once again wane. There really is no great champion of Japan these days on Capitol Hill. This has been sort of a unique feature of the relationship. Beyond Mike Mansfield, who was, the majority leader in the Senate, you had Tom Foley, Denny Hastert as speakers, my old boss, chairman of the Finance Committee, and finally Senator Danny Inouye, who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee until he passed away a couple of years back. And there's no one who's taken on that mantle. Plus the alliance managers, as they're called, the Rich Armitages and Joe Nyes are getting up there. They're in their 70s. Mike Green is my age, and there's no sort of next generation to handle the relationship. I'm not sure it's a great idea to have such a small number handling the relationship, but that's sort of the way things have been, and always the expectation of the Japanese. Of course, Korea doesn't really have a powerful champion on the Hill either, but again, you have a strong group of voters who care about it. Excuse me. And the comfort women issue remains unsolved. And so long as that's the case, I hope it's solved, but the victims will always be seen in a better light than what the Japanese did. And frankly, the Japanese present their case in the United States in really the most counterproductive ways. They talk about the specific numbers are wrong, or others did this. It comes across in a way that it leaves Americans wondering whether the Japanese understand how to present themselves in front of Americans. It sounds like they're just minimizing what happened, which was terrible stuff. That's not to say that Korea should let this issue continue to boil away, because if Japan were willing to offer appropriate response, and based on conversations I've had just a couple days ago at the Conte, it sounds like Japan is really, and Prime Minister Abe is willing to go quite far. If Korea refuses to accept what seems reasonable, that could be a problem for Korea. So what happens in the aftermath of this recent Korea-Japan summit is something that people in Washington are going to be watching very carefully. Many in Washington believe that this took a nudge from the president 18 months ago at The Hague to get this started. And we're all hoping that something comes of this relatively short order. Now, just to sort of close here, I think it's important to realize that when it comes to Japan and Korea in Washington, basically, I don't think many people view this as a competition with one another in Washington. You're both allies and partners. You're both democracies. You've got open economies, shared values. But I think as I've gone through this, I hope what's become clear is that it's really the events that have shaped the state of relations between these countries. It's the policies that have been adopted. It's the people who have been involved. It's the changing nature of the security environment in the Asia Pacific, which are important. Currently, Japan does have some advantages. If you go back to wanting to frame it in terms of a competition, advantages in a sort of a broader infrastructure in Washington and elsewhere in terms of organizations that promote U.S.-Japan relations. Plus, it's important to recognize that there is the strong belief that Japan is, in fact, the anchor for the U.S. in Asia as compared to South Korea. And there's little likelihood that will change. But again, Korea has some inherent strength, cohesive Korean American community, a much better ability to present yourselves to an American audience than Japanese, and people do remember that we did fight a brutal war with the Japanese while we fought on the same side with Korea. Looking forward, Prime Minister Abe is suffering from diminished political approval, and it looks like he's looking to make some deals with Kim Jong-un over abductees, maybe with the Russians over the Northern Territories. And while neither deal seems all that likely, if and when one of these deals actually were constructed, depending how it's constructed, it could be viewed quite negatively in Washington. And in Korea's case, depending on the state of U.S.-China relations, Korea's position on that in that context is important. And if Korea is seen as tilting too far toward China, that could be problematic. And finally, the TPP, I think, is going to be an important issue going forward. The essence of that deal is the U.S.-Japan FTA. How Japan plays its hand on that is going to be important. How it fits into the presidential election is going to be important, and the debate in Congress. It looks like it's going to be very difficult because just a couple days ago, the now chairman of the Finance Committee said it has to be renegotiated. But there's also an issue of, if it goes forward, whether whether Korea joins at some point in the future, which I hope personally happens. Anyway, those are some thoughts on this, but I think at the moment what people in Washington are really going to be looking at over the next few weeks, months, is what actually comes out of the recent PAC-Abe meeting. So with that, happy to answer questions, comments.
Thank you. Thank you for your insightful presentation on